Hello. The title of this lecture is Christianity in Asia from the year 1540 to 1700. European exploration in the late 1400s and the 1500s opened the world for European influence. Trade was a driving force for exploration, but so was the desire to spread Christianity. By the mid 1500s, Catholic leaders wanted to see the Catholic faith reach many regions of the globe, including China. The Ming dynasty, founded in 1368, lasted until 1644. It came after a century of rule by the Mongols. Restoring order and putting more emphasis on Christian traditions, the Ming dynasty proved to be one of the stablest and longest dynasties of Chinese history. The principal aim of Ming foreign policy was to maintain China's security and to make certain that the Mongols would not threaten China. The building and the restoration of the Great Wall of China in the 1400s and the 1500s demonstrated the desire to ensure order and control contact with the outside world. This emphasis on security influenced on whether Christianity could be introduced in China. When the dynasty was young and vigorous, emperors ruled wisely and the people prospered. As the dynasty grew old, corruption crept into the bureaucracy and emperors became feeble and ineffective leaders. A faction ridden bureaucracy made decisions without meaningful guidance or even participation by the emperors. Factionalism was not the only problem. Many peasants starved when China was hit with famines, and there had been some particularly bad ones in the early 1600s. There were also popular protests when Chinese leaders levied additional taxes to pay for military expenditures on the northern border. The end of the Ming dynasty came in 1644 with the invasion of the Manchus and disenchanted rebels. The Manchus lived to the northeast in heavily forested areas and depended on hunting, agriculture, and trade. Their hunting tradition provided them with the martial values and skills to conquer other peoples. The unification of Manchu tribes into a centralized state in the early 1600s gave them the strength that was required to successfully invade China. Adding to their power was the support that they received from the Chinese who were disillusioned with the corrupt leadership of the Ming dynasty. When the Manchus struck the Forbidden City, the emperor and his family committed suicide. Now, what followed was the establishment of the Qing dynasty, and this dynasty lasted right into the early 20th century. The Qing dynasty viewed their dynasty as pure, and they forbade intermarriage between the Manchus and the Chinese. Chinese men were forced to wear a queue as a form of submission, And this is a plate of hair hanging at the back of the head. Nevertheless, China grew even stronger during the Qing dynasty, and it maintained either direct or indirect control over most of Asia. Both the Ming and Qing dynasties relied upon the same massive bureaucratic machine, with the emperor as the son of heaven situated in the center. Civil service examinations ensured the production of scholar bureaucrats to run the government. The rulers wanted society to follow a hierarchical and patriarchal social order. Foot binding is an example of the inferior status of women. Women with small feet were given special status. Females of wealthy families or attractive females among the peasantry were had their feet bound, and this process was where one had their feet bound very very tightly by strips of cloth. It was an excruciating, painful process, and this is something that women endured for not only months but years. And the end result were these tiny feet, and in essence, deformed feet. But dainty feet apparently generated erotic arousal among men, and women with such feet could not perform physical labor, but that was the point. As for farm labor, only a very small percentage of China's land was suitable for cultivation, but the Chinese worked well with what they had. They used a combination of intensive farming and the introduction of new crops to ensure enough food for society. From 1500 to 1700 to 1750, excuse me, 1750, the population of China increased from 100 to 225 million. The overwhelming majority of the people lived in villages and spent much of their time working on the land. Throughout China, the peasants had their own dialects, and consequently, peasants in one region probably did not understand what others were saying in other regions. And this issue of language would become an obstacle for missionaries. The emperors supported Confucian tradition, which called for self discipline and obedience to established leaders. Confucianism is a system of ethical precepts or interactions. The key precepts were benevolent love, righteousness, wise leadership, and sincerity. It was designed to inspire and preserve the good management of the family, which stood in the center of society. In fact, what we have here is the family serving as a bridge between the individual and the government. Future missionaries required an understanding of Confucianism to improve their opportunities for successful spreading of the gospel and sharing of Christianity. So the picture then of China is that most of the people were on farms. It was agricultural based, and you would have a very vast area, and you would have uh, various regions doing doing things quite differently, different languages. They would be living in different housing, but they all were shared a common sense in that they would be farmers and living off the land. And this is important because of how much uh, influence the various missionaries would have. And at least in the earlier stage, it would have been primarily areas close along the coast, and it would obviously the logistics would have been very difficult for missionaries to go inland, and even when we reach a point in the history of China where this was happening, which was happened much later, we have the issue with the difficulty of language. Now, just to take us back in European history and how this sort of unfolded, it was in the late 1400s that the Pope had actually split the unchristian world between Portugal and Spain. And it was Portugal that was apportioned, that Africa and Asia was apportioned to Portugal. And what followed in the late 1400s was the explorations by Vasco da Gama, and there were others that followed, but the exploration of da Gama clarified that the Portuguese, if there was going to be, if they really thought there could be an actual conquest of Asia, this became clear that this was impossible. This was not going to happen because Asia, and I'm referring to India and other points east, it was just too vast. It was too vast of a territory, and also, of course, the population. There's just no way that a small nation like the Portugal could possibly have conquer Asia. But there was the realistic hope that Portugal could establish, a policy of trade, and the first step was to establish military bases, and there were a chain of military bases that they set up in the east that allowed them to protect trade. Now, after the Protestant Reformation, the Portuguese king sent Francis Xavier, a Jesuit, to the Portuguese colonies in the east. In 1542, Xavier arrived in India, where in time his preaching attracted large crowds. Many of the Indians who converted to Christianity were from the lower caste. The caste system prohibited people of different castes to spend time with each other. By accepting Christianity and participating in communion, Indian Christians believed they had joined, in essence, the caste of the Portuguese. Indians belonging to the higher caste viewed the preaching of Christianity as subversive. So, what we see actually is that many of the Indians that had been converted, that underwent conversion, were from the lower caste. And in They thought that by way of baptism that they would become part of the Portuguese caste. This was a step in a forward step, a step in the right direction in the sense of them gaining greater status. And then this is one reason why the people of the higher caste looked upon this with suspicion. But as far as Xavier, 4 years after his arrival in India, he traveled further to the east. Now, eventually, he sailed to Japan. He arrived in Japan, where he began a flourishing church. Xavier dreamed of preaching Christianity in China, but Jesuit leaders ordered him to return to India. While in India, Xavier wrote to the King of Portugal about mission work in China. Quote, "What encourages us is that God has inspired this thought in us, and we do not doubt that the power of God is infinitely superior to the power of the King of China." End of quote. Although Xavier sailed to China, the Chinese government, distrustful of foreign influences, did not allow him to enter. The Jesuits failed to show that European culture and Christianity were separate. Baptized converts received Christian names, and many of these converts saw themselves as Portuguese, at least as subjects of the Portuguese king. Until there was a clear distinction between European culture and the Christian faith, it was harder for the Jesuits to earn the trust of various leaders. Now, subsequent waves of Jesuits made efforts to accommodate Christianity with Asian culture. The Jesuit Roberto di Nobili dressed as an upper caste Indian to reach Indians of higher status. He also adopted an Indian diet and he learned Sanskrit. When members of the higher caste converted to Christianity, they worshiped in churches that did not include members of the lower caste. Nobili recognized that the caste system was evil, but he saw it as a cultural rather than religious matter. This was the justification for his methodology. Others oppose this method, arguing, quote, that justice and love are part of the gospel and that to deny these is not to preach true Christianity. The Jesuits desired to reach the Chinese who remained suspicious of foreigners. Historian Justo Gonzalez writes, seeing that China was a highly civilized society that looked upon the rest of the world as barbarians, the Jesuits decided that the only way to make an impact on that vast land was to learn not only its language, but also its culture. In time, the Jesuits began to earn the respect of some Chinese intellectuals who saw the Jesuits as worthy of respect. It was Matteo Ricci who made a strong impact on the Chinese. Ricci was born in Italy in the year 1552. His family represented the lower nobility, as his mother came from a noble family. His father worked as a pharmacist. While at Jesuit college, Ricci proved exceptionally bright. His father desired that he become a lawyer, but Matteo chose the Jesuits instead. The Jesuits had an appealing reputation as a culturally elite group of priests who were highly disciplined, passionate, and courageous. The, the Jesuits were well known for their courage. They were willing to go wherever they were ordered to go. Matteo Ricci was one of the Jesuits who was granted permission to settle in one region of China. Ricci focused on learning the language, which was a difficult task even for someone intellectually gifted. With much work, he became fluent in Chinese. He did not stop there. He proceeded to study Chinese history and philosophy. And he was doing this because he understood that his Christian work would be more successful if the Chinese looked upon him as their intellectual equal. And this made perfect sense, but because again, the Chinese looked at outsiders as barbarians. They did not look upon the Europeans in a favorable fashion. They did not see them to be equal of of the Chinese. Now, Ricci accommodated Christianity to reach the Chinese, but his approach was less extreme than Nobilize in India. In the case of back in India, Nobili was, he accepted the higher castes having their own church and excluding anyone else. He, he allowed that to happen. With the case of Ricci, a little bit more subtle. Ricci became known in China as a man of refinement. He demonstrated his impressive knowledge of geography, astronomy, mathematics, and even clockmaking. Receiving the title the Wise Man from the West, Ricci was able to direct the attention of the Chinese to Western culture, which in the past they actually had not given much notice. So, in other words, Ricci attempted to win converts by impressing the Chinese leaders with examples of European technology. And there were the technology of Europe was actually quite impressive. And this is something actually historians are talking more about. In the past, there was the notion that the Dark Ages were dark, but recent scholarship has began to make has revised that perspective, and we now have a better sense of the various advancements that were taking place, that had taken place in Europe, as actually throughout the medieval period, but particular when we enter the late medieval period. Anyway, what we have here is Ricci, who is exceptionally bright, and he has lots of knowledge and an awareness of European technology, and he's able to impress the various Chinese intellectuals. The one thing the Chinese admired was his map of the world that showed them areas that they did not know about. All right, so I guess I made that point twice. Equally impressive were his explanations of the movements of heavenly bodies and his understanding of mathematical principles. His work, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, completed and published in 1603, attempted to convince the Chinese that the philosophies of Jesus and Confucius were actually very similar. Unlike other Jesuits elsewhere, Ricci was cautious about converting large numbers that might cause the Chinese leaders to stop all efforts of spreading and sharing Christianity. So he wanted to be, tread carefully here. He wanted not to have the Chinese leaders close up shop. He wanted to be able to continue his missionary work. He thought it best not to preach to large numbers and not to build churches. Only in his home did he have success in converting members of the intellectual elite to Christianity. Now, after Ricci after Ricci's death, and he never did return to Europe. After his death, Chinese Christians would go on to convert others. So his work did continue. In Europe, Catholic leaders objected to Ricci's his tolerance of Confucianism and ancestor worship. The Dominicans and Franciscans, in particular, argued that ancestor worship was idolatry. And in Chinese homes, there were small tablets adorned with the names of ancestors. And what we see is happening is on special dates, family members offer food and burn incense for a particular ancestor. And but Reese did not object to this. He did not. Reese did not see this as idolatry. It was really just the practice of family piety that had been a part of Chinese culture for centuries. Although he admired Chinese culture, he despised Chinese religions on the basis that there was no salvation outside of the church. Simply put, Buddhism, for example, was idolatry. The Buddhist belief that the absolute is innate and is present in all human beings was heresy. Ricci argued Confucianism was really just a pagan philosophy rather than a religion. Thomas Aquinas had used Aristotle to expand the Christian faith, and Ricci used Confucius to reach the Chinese with a Christian message. As one historian explains, the Jesuits believed that if it had been possible to find seeds of divine grace in the polytheistic and otherwise pagan cultures of Greece and Rome, then traces of the same Holy Spirit could be found in the highly sophisticated civilizations of Japan and China. However, it is important to note that there was no clear agreement among the Jesuits regarding the best approach for preaching the gospel. The Chinese emperor eventually discouraged Christian preaching in China. This was a response to the papal declaration against Confucianism and the conclusion that the Chinese were wrong to have to have um, to have two possible Chinese words for the Christian God. Justo Gonzalez writes that the emperor was incensed at the notion that a barbarian who did not know a word of Chinese presumed to teach the Chinese how to speak their own language. Of course, there was always the concern that foreigners would cause instability. Nonetheless, the work of Matteo Ricci and others resulted in conversions. Excuse me. Your emperors came and went. Besides, not even the most repressive laws against Christianity could stop the spread of the gospel. By the year 1700, there were as many as 300,000 converts in China.